Welcome to the third episode in our video lecture series for English 333, Comics and Graphic Novels. To tell you the truth, that title, Comics and Graphic Novels, is a bit awkward. It's redundant. After all, graphic novels are a subset of comics. Comics come in many different formats and different physical and electronic media. The graphic novel is just one of those formats. So the title, Comics and Graphic Novels, is redundant, like rectangles and squares, or chips and Doritos. Whatever. We are here to study comics. In this course, as I've said, you'll be reading comics, analyzing and writing about comics, and even trying your hand at making a comic yourself. But let's get to the basic question of definition. What is comics? In our course, comics is synonymous with comics art. Comics art, or comics for short, is an art form comparable to, say, poetry, or drama, painting, or dance. We'll often use the word comics the way we might use a word like painting or dance. We can say comics is an art form, just the way we would say painting is an art form. Notice that the word comics can be singular. Comics is, as in comics is an art form. However, and this can be a bit confusing, comics can also be plural, as in these comics are great, or man, these comics suck. So comics can be a singular collective noun like painting, or maybe plural. But enough grammar. Depending on your point of view, comics art is either an ancient practice, perhaps even as ancient as art itself, or it's a modern practice that comes into its own in the 18th and 19th centuries. With the onset of industrialization and the wide circulation of printed texts. Scholars have sometimes proposed other terms for comics, terms that seem more precise and analytical. For example, some scholars prefer to call comics sequential art. Some prefer to call it graphic narrative. Both of these are useful terms. You will see them, you'll run into them. Neither of them, I think, perfectly captures everything that is interesting and important about comics. So neither one is a perfect synonym. But let's face it, the term comics itself is a pretty imperfect term for this art form. It just happens to be the term that most people in our culture know. So it's the term that we're stuck with. Scholars argue about the origins and history of comics. Where did comics come from? When and under what circumstances were comics invented? Who invented comics, if we may speak of comics as having one inventor, whether it was a single artist or a single culture? Scholars even argue about how to define comics. Now, if you're interested in these debates, I will have a relevant PDF and a PowerPoint slideshow for you, which I'll be posting under our Canvas modules soon. For our purposes, comics is a way of telling stories through graphic images, that is, through pictures. To be more precise, comics tell stories, or make arguments, or depict processes, or share memories and impressions through pictures that are usually drawn and usually combined with other elements, such as other pictures or written texts. As you can see here, comics can even give instructions. comics' combination of elements means that comics can communicate in more complex ways than a single image by itself usually can. Some comics have no words. Then again, some comics have a lot of words. Sometimes reading a comic can feel like watching a movie. On the other hand, sometimes reading a comic can feel like reading a handwritten personal letter from a friend. In our class, most of the comics we'll be reading will consist of long series of pictures combined with written text and arranged into spatial configurations that we will call layouts. We may occasionally run into exceptions, say comics with fewer pictures or only one picture, or comics without words. But in general, we'll be interested in sequential pictures mixed with written text and presented in spatial layouts. That, for English 333, is the prototype of what comics is. So, comics, a form of storytelling or communication, usually consisting of sequential pictures, often with text, arranged in spatial layouts. In our next video, I'll talk a bit more about the origins of the term comics and about our own working definition of the form. See you then.